This is the Enragé, a show where we take a deeper dive into written works published at the Center for a Stateless Society. Join us as we give voice to the ideas challenging the vain phantoms that haunt our social reality and stand in the way of total liberation. For more information, visit c4ss.org. And to support this show or any of the other projects happening at the Center, please visit patreon.com/c4ss.org. Thank you for listening.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the 26th installment of the Enragé. This is your host, Eric Fleischman. Today we'll be joined for the second time by Shane Ross to discuss their article, Emma Goldman and Individualist Anarchism, which is part of the Center for a Stateless Society's Mutual Exchange Symposium on Egoism. Shane is a daoist, anarchist, and mutualist writer based in the Twin Cities. They focus on community education and mutual aid in their local area and plan to continue studying philosophy through college. This is Shane's second appearance on the Enragé, with the first time being hosted by my predecessor, Joel Williamson. And last time, Shane talked about their article, Malicious Faux Individualism and Market Anti-Capitalism, which we'll link below with that in the episode notes. Shane, thank you for coming on again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure here at the Enragé. How you doing?
I'm doing good. It's been quite the week for me. Went up north and whatever, but just got back from the thrift store, ready to sit down and talk about anarchy or whatever.
Hell yeah. Well then, let's not delay. Let's just jump right into the article. Can you please give our audience a brief summary of the article and why you chose to write it?
Yeah, so Corey, who is like one of the directors of the Center for a Stateless Society, he's the director of the social media page. He reached out to me as the Mutual Exchange Symposium was occurring on egoism, being like, hey, would love your input here. And I was thinking what I could provide to a discussion about egoism. And Emma Goldman is an anarchist who I've read and studied for a long time. She was the first anarchist I ever read, actually. And I've always admired her work. And so I was like, you know what? I think it's time we bring a little more Goldman discussion to the center. So what this article is sort of an introduction to Emma Goldman and how she formulates and balances her sort of like egoist anarchism with her also social collectivist anarchism. And also I used her analysis to discuss other thinkers, specifically Nietzsche and Stirner, and how they're sort of touted as both like anarchists, but also anti-anarchists, and how they may or may not be useful to our discussion. So, yeah.
Well, I doubt there are many in our audience who haven't heard of Emma Goldman, but let's kick things off with you. How about you give some background on Goldman and why you would write an article about her for our symposium on egoism?
Yeah, so Goldman, she was a pretty cool chick, gotta say. She was... Okay, I'm going to try my best not to do a whole biographical statement right now, but she was an anarchist who was active in many corners of the world around the late 20th or late 19th and early 20th century. And she was interesting because she was a communist anarchist who took a lot from Kropotkin and Bakunin and these sort of social anarchist figures that we often think of. But also she drew a lot from Nietzsche, and she wrote about how important the individual was, and she drew a lot from Stirner, and she sort of balanced these two, often seen at the time as like opposing schools of anarchism within her writing. And in doing so, she also introduced elements like feminism and queer rights and anti-racism into her writing, making her, I think, a formidable force in anarchism then, and also a formidable force in anarchism in our analysis of it today.
Absolutely. Well, the first of Goldman's influences that you write about is Nietzsche, and in particular his concepts of the Übermensch and the will to power. Can you talk about what these concepts are and maybe what Goldman's readings of them are?
Yep. So Nietzsche he was a complicated dude. It's hard to pinpoint his exact ideology because since his philosophical time, he's been utilized by fascists and anarchists alike. But in essence, a lot of what his philosophy was trying to do was sort of critique standing moral standards and ethical standards for holding people back, as he saw them, from reaching some untapped potential. And he was trying to see the flaws in human society and humanity as we organized it and sort of supersede that. So the Ubermensch, depending on your reading of Zarathustra, is sort of a theoretical new species of man that has superseded all of like the petty qualms and moral disputes of current man, and it's just sort of this like it's almost like a individual utopia. It's like the ultimate person, the ultimate man. The direct German translation is the Overman. And then the will to power, depending on who you ask, is it's either a political thing, a political desire for power. But I think, according to Goldman and according to a lot of much cooler Nietzsche scholars, the will to power is less so the innate desire to dominate, as certain people would put it, but rather a sort of ontological status of potential, a sort of natural ontological substance of sorts that wants to actualize itself in the way that people and things occur. So I know that sounds like a bunch of, postmodernist mumbo jumbo, but a will to power, like I talked about Deleuze's interpretation of the will to power, but essentially it's agency, right? It's the ability to actualize one's desires. It's the ability to exist as one wants to in society. Okay. Um, but yeah, it's the sort of agency and ability to do what one wants to do and see what one wants to be done in society. And then Goldman specifically moves forward with the Ubermensch as sort of superseding typical Hegelian master-slave dialectics, and I talk about that a bit in the article. But I use the example of how she might say that, like, in patriarchy, men become the masters and women become the slaves. And oftentimes people miscredit Nietzsche and say that he was trying to, a quote of his is that he was trying to eliminate the potential of people to quote unquote breed a race of weaklings and slaves. And people see that as like, oh, he hated the underclass. The Ubermensch is the dominator. It's the fascist. It's the oppressor. But Goldman's interpretation is more so that the Ubermensch would supersede these petty master-slave dichotomies that keep both men and women trapped in, say, the patriarchy, and instead allow society and humanity to move forward in sort of a new ethical lens focused on the will to power, and on agency and being and stuff. So yeah.
That sounds pretty cool to me. But you mentioned, that Nietzsche has been used by fascists as well as anarchists, and you actually title this section Nietzsche the Authoritarian.
Yes.
Can you talk about some of the ways that Nietzsche, as opposed to Emma Goldman's interpretations, have been used to justify authoritarianism?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I kind of touched on, readings of Nietzsche span a lot of different political ideologies, and his sort of language surrounding weaklings and slaves and getting rid of the meek of society, it was in his mind, or in the mind of a lot of Nietzsche scholars, sort of the anti-Christian, anti-pity the meek, pity the sick, whatever. And that was his way of sticking it to the Catholic man, so to speak. But in the same breath, he sort of eliminated a lot of what is in Christianity seen as kind and forgiving and merciful to especially the lower class. And so fascists pick up on that, and his use of the Übermensch and his use of language around masters and slaves. And that's why a lot of historically fascists, right-wing figures, authoritarians, including his sister, Elizabeth Nietzsche, who was a personal friend of Adolf Hitler's, sort of use his ideology to breed anti-Semitism and breed justifications for horrific acts of violence against the underclass, even though he, in his time, condemned anti-Semitism and condemned these sort of authoritarian structures.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, Nietzsche's sister, didn't she gift Hitler his walking cane and go back and edit a
She
bunch of
might have.
I'm sure I read that somewhere. But
Yeah, Hitler and Elizabeth, one of them attended the other one's funeral. They were close.
gotcha. Well, so that's Nietzsche, and Nietzsche in Goldman's ideas.
That's me.
Yeah. Now let's move on to the other German individualist you talk about, which was Max Stirner. And you talk about Stirner in particular, and Goldman's use of him to critique democracy and groupthink. And this might be confusing to some people who are aware that Goldman was a communist. So you cover this in your article, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about it. Is how does Goldman square this view, this influence from Stirner, with her communist politics, especially when you point out that, quote, when applied to economics, we can also formulate a criticism using Nietzsche of some of the democratic planning spouted by further left anti-capitalism, as opposed to us market anarchists.
Yeah. So I think that a key distinction here to be made is between, I don't know, in my experience, spending a few years around anarchists, there's kind of two types of anarcho-communists. And some anarcho-communists are essentially Marxists that are like, ooh, we should do extra democracy. We should really focus on no leaders or whatever. But some anarcho communists genuinely see structures of property as dominating and want to see communism not as some sort of like Marxist governmental pipe dream, but rather as a fulfillment of a profound lack of ownership and a sort of free economy of just pure, I don't know, sharing and individual autonomy. And I think that Goldman is really espousing the ideas of the latter. So she, in her writings, she takes ideas like Stirner's anti-groupthink and poses them against governmentalism, including Marxism, and she had critiques of other communists such as Marx and Engels and even Kropotkin, for their use of sort of these in democratic councils and democratic decision making bodies that would theoretically govern some communist economies. But she sees communism as more so a lack of ownership, a complete lack of property, which is a system. The proprietary system was also a system that she saw as necessarily oppressive, necessarily anti-individual, and she borrows a lot of those ideas from Proudhon as well. So I think that she squares her sort of anti-groupthink, anti-democracy um, anarchism with communism by seeing communism not as democratic economy, but as sort of the lack thereof of the authoritarian and proprietary economy.
And where does Stirner's influence come in here specifically?
So Stirner, as far as his own economic views, they're a little iffy, but the way Goldman uses Stirner's economic views, she sort of takes his definitively anti-groupthink, anti the authority of the masses, anti-group control, anti-democracy, and implements them in a way that is both anti-property, as anarchists have commonly understood it, and anti-democracy, as anarchists have commonly understood it, and instead just positing an economy of transition to pure liberty and pure possession. And depending on who you ask, her economic differences with someone like Voltaire de Cleyre may put her as a communist, may just put her as like an anarchist without adjectives. But throughout her life, she was always a labor advocate, a socialist, and somebody who really cared about the working class, while also taking those Stirner ideas and fighting against the ideas of controlling democracy and the dictatorship of the proletariat, the dictatorship of the masses.
In contrast to sort of ideas of the dictatorship of the proletariat, You also talk about Stirner's idea specifically of the union of egoists, and in particular, its
Yes.
application to economics.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, in contrast to, the more democratic planning, can you briefly explain what exactly a union of egoists is and what it looks like in an economic context?
Yeah. So I think, democracy and democratic planning it sort of establishes itself, at least according to Malatesta, as this sort of, you're in the group, but if we end up not liking your individual opinion, you have to do what we say, regardless of whether or not you actually voted for it, which still presents an issue of authoritarian control. Whereas Stirner's union of egoists is this sort of free-floating collective of people with similar interests where people can come and go as they please. So contracts are enforced by trust between completely voluntary subjects with personally established reasons to continue on with a set relationship or agreement beyond coerced power dynamics. So in economics, we could imagine, because I think at some level a division of labor is both a natural necessity and something that people, will want to establish. If affinity and opportunity are natural, trade would be carried out in production between completely voluntary subjects, with trust regulating trade and with these sort of economic exchanges happening on a voluntary basis rather than on a planned basis by any sort of democratic committee, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. And that sounds awfully close to the sort of individualist anarchism of Proudhon and later Tucker and De Cleyre and folks like that.
Yes, yeah. And my application of the union of egoists in in the economy, is less so something that I get from Goldman and is more so something I get from my own mutualism. But I think that in general, those ideas of anti-groupthink and anti-democracy and anti-proprietarianism that are espoused by Goldman and Stirner really lend themselves well to the lens that we often employ when we're talking about left market anarchism, and I think that we can really get a lot from that.
Yeah, for sure. So, like Stirner and Nietzsche both, Goldman also makes a move to reject morality as you say, quote, the tendency to suppress desire and autonomy, to deprave, to punish those starving, and not those who are guilty of starving them. And yet at the same time, you point to her, quote, fundamentally positive ethic of liberty, which positioned itself in absolute favor of individualism and freedom. We talked a little bit about, other philosophical concepts, union of egoist, overcoming the dialectic things. I'm curious, what makes this ethic of absolute individualism and freedom non or even anti-moral? How does Goldman move past traditional morality?
Yeah. So I think that a really careful reading of Nietzsche sort of establishes the fact that there is no way to be completely without ethics. Because at their base, ethics are just the philosophy of judging action, and as long as you are making decisions and doing actions, you are establishing a set of ethics. So when we read Goldman, and when we see that she, like the quote you said, she's rejecting morality for its tendency to suppress desire and autonomy, to deprave, to punish, to condemn. These are all words that she is in essence saying are negative. She's rejecting morality for its tendency to deprave and condemn and suppress. And we see the reason here is because she's constructing not any sort of strict moral code with which to judge action and try to control people's behavior, but a sort of idea of what a person could be, that instead of enacting rules that tries to limit them to some sort of social standard of conformability, just sort of establishes the ethical as that which lets people do what they want to do. It's live and let live, but like with a lot more philosophical jargon.
Gotcha.
But I think that her fundamentally positive ethic of liberty is positive because it's the same way that Nietzsche's is, right? It's rejecting all these standards of morality that sort of limit people. And in that sense, its very critique is that we should not limit people. We should let people flourish. We should let people be. And so she establishes an ethical stance that is anti-suppression because it is ultimately for flourishing.
That's really interesting. It's I studied philosophy in college, and I've heard a lot of different definitions of ethic and morals, and I like what you're putting out. I like the emphasis on the negative and the positive aspects.
Yeah. I think that, more college philosophy programs need to listen to 17-year-olds on the internet, if anything.
Yeah.
That's
Yes,
where their
that's
real
the
knowledge
listener.
is.
That is the official stance of the Anarchist.
Good.
So
Yeah.
throughout your article, you also reference, and we've talked about, Goldman's real and potential influences on mutualists and market anarchists. You mentioned how Goldman and mutualists like Voltaire and Declare viewed property differently. What else differentiates Goldman from the North American individualist anarchists? And what are some things that we as neo-mutualist, market anarchists, left libertarians should learn and incorporate from Goldman?
Yeah. That's quite the list of adjectives for us. You said
I know.
neo-mutualist, left market anarchist. Okay. I'm a fan of a lot of adjectives. Anarchism with so many adjectives. Anarchism is not anarchism unless it has at least 11 preceding adjectives. Yeah. Okay. So I think that Goldman differentiates herself from a lot of familiar faces in American anarchism, not just in sort of our already established ways of proprietary differences and different, ethical justifications than, say, Proudhon or Tucker. Although Proudhon, not American, we'll ignore that.
Mhm.
I think that these really makes sense, and you can make better sense of these differences if you put them in a historical framework, and you just realize that, Goldman's influences, Goldman's inspirations for her anarchism were very different than, say, Tucker and Spooner and these familiar American faces. Because instead of living in a society that is plastering the word liberty on everything, but still sort of keeping the underclass down, which is where Tucker and Spooner get off, critiquing the Bill of Rights, critiquing the Declaration of Independence, and saying, we have these American ideas of liberty, let's fulfill them. She isn't from America, and so her ideas of anarchism are more inspired by the sort of socialist spheres of Europe, those with Kropotkin, those that discuss how ultimately the best way to eliminate capitalism is to eliminate authority altogether. So I think we're coming at anarchism from two different angles, so to speak, historically, but they meet in the middle. And in her discussions with Voltaire and Declare and Kropotkin and all of these sorts of figures from both European and American anarchism throughout her life, she ends up informing a lot of the ways that we as Americans and the American school of anarchism have understood things like property and democracy and authority. And we can see her tangible impact in the ways that throughout, say, Declare's life, she shifted her ideologies away from that sort of Spoonerite, hardline, Lockean anarchist, way of thinking about property to a sort of looser, possessive, pro, Proudhonian, or even to the left of Proudhon way of viewing property. So we saw changes in the individual opinions of American anarchists because of Emma Goldman's words, and we also saw a greater emphasis on labor by the American anarchists because of Emma Goldman's words and her organizing and her, she would go to Chicago and she would organize labor marches, and I think that her impact on American anarchism needs to be stated as that which introduced, or didn't introduce, but strengthened a lot of these core socialist elements of anarchism as they are understood on the American continent.
That's a great way to put it. That's a really great way to put it. And her and Dyer Lum both served as really good crossovers between the Chicago and the Boston anarchists in that sense, the labor elements.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's that's Emma Goldman and individualist anarchism. I also wanted to take time in this podcast because you and I are both member owners of the website Mutualism Co-op. and you longer than I. And we haven't really had a chance to talk about it in private, so why not we do it in public on a podcast?
That's, yeah. For all transparency, we are going to do it where everybody can listen. That's how more places should make business decisions, actually. Just
I think so
public.
too. I think we're trying to be very transparent.
This is really punk rock of us to do right now, and I think that we should be proud of ourselves.
I am proud of us.
Yeah, me too.
So let's start at the basics. What is Mutualism Co-op for you, and how did it get started?
Okay, so I'm gonna classic podcast move here. I'm gonna take a question you just asked me and be like, back in the year was 2009. No, but I remember I remember trying to learn more about mutualism as I first discovered anarchism when I was like 13, and I there was a complete and utter lack of resources anywhere on the internet. The Wikipedia page did not make sense. Most websites were spouting mutualism as the, biologically useful whatever occurrence in science where two things reciprocally benefit from an exchange, which honestly, that's probably a great definition of mutualism. If you're really thinking about it, read like the science textbook definition and just be like, how could this be in a market? That's mutualism. But I think that there was such a crippling lack of information and easy to find resources and compilations out there. And the center was a great place to find information, but there was no place that was just mutualist. So after a few years of, getting my hands dirty and actually trying to figure out what the hell mutualism is, I was approached with an opportunity to work on the website on this center that would compile mutualist content and hopefully provide links and maybe create our own content that would help people better understand the school of thought and help people better integrate the school of thought into their own thinking. So I am the propaganda machine and I am proud of it.
And beyond propaganda machine, what is your role at the co-op?
Yeah, so my role has mostly thus far just been managing social media, specifically Twitter. Although we've had discussions about, me managing Patreon. We don't have any patrons, which is why I've been slacking because nobody sees our Patreon posts. So if you're listening to this, if you want me to do more work, become our patron, give us money. It's a great idea.
I will put the Patreon link in the episode notes.
Yeah, go to the episode notes right now and give me your money, please. All right, thank you. But I promise I will not be using it for anything other than to educate the world on mutualism and all it has to offer. So yeah, I've been sort of the social media manager. I've also been known to occasionally check an email if I'm feeling a little cheeky. Um, yeah, I think that I've just sort of been holding up the Twitter fort for now, but I don't see myself leaving anytime soon. And I think that there's been discussions of also when Mutualism Co-op decides eventually to sort of produce its own media, maybe in the form of podcasts or zines or whatever, I could be involved there as well.
Awesome. And on that note, podcast zines, do you have any plans or ideas that you'd want us to do in the future for the website, off the website?
I mean, I just think that it'd be cool if we could sort of produce those podcast zine like type things because the fact that the Center for Stateless Society does it, that's how a lot of people get information. And it's really cool to have all these sort of translated things and easily printable zines that we can give out. And I think that it's a big benefit to the entire anarchist community to have just more resources and more information and more places for people to go. So eventually, I think if we were going to do podcasts and zines, whether it be on, consulting 17-year-olds for their political opinions on the internet or something that's actually worth listening to, I think that either way, it's a good time investment to focus on producing those. And I don't know, I don't really have any ideas for specific podcasts as of yet. I guess I'll have to brainstorm.
I mean, I like so far the zine idea. I feel like it would be really cool to have a section on the website that was like Mutualism 101 zines, and we could even just take some of them straight from the C4SS zine library and
Oh, for
just
sure.
like the
Nothing
base.
more mutualist than like stealing intellectual property and being like, check out our zines, dude. You know?
Hey, that is exactly what the center wants us to do.
It's true. Actually, all of their books are like, please republish this. Don't give us credit. Like,
yeah. It's the Woody Guthrie license. It's in the beginning of the books. It's like, if we catch someone reproducing this without our permission, we'll give them a darn thanks. But yeah, I think that a zine section would be cool. I also have been thinking, I'm like, what could we do that would be a cool gimmick for a podcast? Because like the Enragé here, we talk about specific articles that have been published at the center, with
yeah.
their authors. And as much as like a standard, like, oh, it's just two like people interviewing anarchists would be cool, I kind of feel like we need a shtick. We need like a gimmick for our podcast that makes us different from the thousands of other two anarchists talking.
Yeah. I think it depends on how far we want to stray from the mutualist idea. Because many a times have I been like, man, I should really start a podcast reviewing episodes of Drag Race. But I don't know. Is the Mutualism Co-op willing to give me the time and space for that? We'll have to
I
see.
mean, once we actually have money,
However, I think it's an untapped market.
I mean, I honestly think it would be kind of cool to have like a media commentary. Like, yeah, that's totally something that would be cool.
Right? Be like, this dress is so fierce. It reminds me of Dire Lum. Like, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, no,
I can make it work.
yeah, I'm sure you can. I have faith. I'll give I mean, as you know, I am in charge of classical articles. I've sort of,
Yes.
made the executive decision that classical is anything before the 60s or anything before the 70s. So I have like 1965.
I feel like that makes sense. Like, that was sort of when, like, 68, 69, that was when, the left sort of shat itself and became something else.
Mm-hmm.
In a good way. But,
it's a moment where it's like, you see like a rise again of this like left-wing market thought of like Rothbard when he wasn't an asshole, and Karl Hess and Robert Anthony Wilson, like of sort of
I think it's important to describe that era of Rothbard as Rothbard when he wasn't an asshole. I think that's really good.
When he wasn't a far right guy who wanted people to sell babies.
Rothbard was such a person. Oh man, such a figure. That can be that can be our podcast. We go through like different years of Rothbard's life and being like, was he a really cool anarchist? Was he basically a paleo? Like, well, you'll just have to find out if he hated minorities or not this time. Like,
history of Rothbard.
Yeah.
But so with that in mind, I feel like I've been making a little bit of an effort to do two things that I kind of want to explain and speak into the universe. One is that I really manifest it, will to power it, if you will.
Yes.
But one is I'm really interested in sort of what you were saying earlier about the sort of like socialist core, particularly like later market anarchists, because Tucker starts as very much like a Lockean, very much like a unterrified Jeffersonian, and then he gets into Stemner and he gets much more radical, and then his sort of quote unquote offspring like Voltaire Declare, Dire Lum, Joseph Labate are all like much more have like a socialist core to them, much more interested in labor politics, much more in like class struggle, and that's some stuff I really want to dig up.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, I like the articles that are like kind of dispelling myths about mutualism and like market anarchism and individualist anarchism. One that I just put up was Sidney E. Parker's Individualism, Anarchism, and the Police, which he is not very nice to Tucker.
Yeah.
But it does do a good job of dispelling the idea that Tucker was like, oh, we should let police break strikes. And like, no, Tucker was actually very pro-labor and was hated the police and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And, or the most recent article, which I suggested, but which is in the contemporary articles, which is the Sean P. Wilbur's Are Hotels Immoral? Because when you start talking about usufruct property, it's like, oh, does that mean we can't have hotels? Like, I think that there's a really good opportunity to dispel a lot of myths too. And that's sort of me explaining my motivations.
Yeah. Okay. I think those are both good, important, core ideas as to, like, you know, what the center could and should focus on as far as media portrayals of anarchism and whatnot. I think that the good news is here's the good news. In the past 3 or so years, I have seen the mutualist sphere of the internet expand by a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Mutualism Co-op is in part part of that process, but also a little bit, responsible for it, because 1,000 Twitter followers, that's not shabby, if I do say so myself. And
You do.
I'm saying so myself. But I think that it would be really cool if we were able to focus on, say, an anarchist look back, an anarchist analysis of the historical labor struggle, and posit that as something that is crucial and important to the mutualist movement, because it is, and it has been for a century. And yeah, I think that I really like that idea. Maybe that's where the zines and podcasts come in, dispelling myths about mutualism being capitalism light, and focusing on its historical and modern relationship with socialist movements and whatnot.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the world is our oyster.
It really is.
Yeah. Well, this has gone by pretty quickly, but I feel like we covered a lot. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to chat about before we call it to a close?
Not really. What are you doing this weekend? What's fun?
Oh my God. The main house on the farm I live on, the roof is rotting, and we have to strip all the roofing off, take all the stuff out of that building, and redo the whole thing. And it's raining, and it's it's kind of a nightmare actually. But
not even that fun. It doesn't even sound that fun.
No, it's not. But it is nice that to do something in solidarity with other people. So it is a collective problem that we have to solve.
Yeah. No, I get that.
What are you doing this weekend?
What am I doing?
Yeah.
Let's see. Ooh, okay. Tonight, y'all are gonna go crazy for this. Okay, tonight I'm going to a local show in Minneapolis, like a punk show, and I realized just now that I don't know if it's a date or not, because I met this guy on an island in the middle of a lake by the Canadian border. Long story. And I was like, what music are you into? And he was like, punk. And I was like, oh my God, we should go to a show together. And he was like, oh my God, we should. And then I was on Instagram and I was like, okay, so we're going to that show. Do you want to grab dinner? And he was like, oh my God, yeah. And we're going to go to the show tonight. And I'm picking him up in an hour. And now I'm thinking, did I accidentally ask him on a date? Because I offered to buy him dinner and drive him somewhere, and we're hanging out all night. And I guess we'll just have to see,
I think you're going on a date.
Okay, well, in that case, I'm about to have a really cool punk rock date.
Nice. Wait, Shane,
Yeah.
Are you a punk?
I dabble. She dabbles.
I'm very much a punk. I grew up in Southern Ohio, Northern Kentucky scene, playing in
Oh,
hard
really?
stuff. Yeah.
Oh,
Wait,
sick.
when we're done with this podcast, I'll send you some of the music that I made back then.
You should absolutely do that. That's exciting.
I will.
Yeah, Minneapolis has a record store called Extreme Noise, and it's the longest owned still standing co-op record store in the country, and it's all punk and hardcore shit, and they have a bunch of free zines, and I don't know, it's a cool scene.
That's very sick.
Yeah.
Well, that's super cool. What's the best way for listeners to check out your work if they found this interview compelling?
Okay. I guess go to my C4SS page because you can do that from the article, which I'm gonna guess is linked in the episode notes.
It is. It
Um,
is.
you can do that from the article on C4SS. I published the Emma Goldman article, my first article, which is honestly sort of what we were talking about dispelling myths about mutualism. That was sort of what my first article on the sites sought to do. And yeah, I also have a deep dive on Marx and Proudhon's their relationship called The End of Anarchy, and I have a more recent, longer, more theoretical writing on Hayek and Foucault and epistemology and Adorno and all these fancy big names. And you can find all of that on the C4SS website.
Amazing. And also go follow the Mutualism Co-op Twitter.
Yeah, go follow the Mutualism Co-op Twitter because I'm working my ass off. Not really. I have to copy and paste things, but you know what? It's just at Mutualism Co-op, at the word mutualism, and then COOP on Twitter. I'll be so happy to see you there. If you DM the account, I'll DM you back with a little meme or something. I don't know.
Amazing.
Reach out, dude. If you have questions, also you can just ask. Find my Twitter and ask me. I will answer them.
Hell yeah. Well, Shane, thank you so much for joining us on the Enragé.
Thank you so much for having me. It has been a blast.
Likewise.